right, we are awaiting a decision from the judge in Donald Trump's New York criminal trial on whether the former president violated his gag order. Here's a live look inside the courthouse. The prosecution alleges the former president violated his gag order several times by speaking and posting about potential witnesses when he was instructed not to. They are asking for 10 posts from his account to be removed. Meanwhile, the defense says Trump did not believe his actions violated the gag order.
Well, CBS News national correspondent Errol Barnett is just outside of the courthouse now following the trial for us. And also, Jessica Levinson is here with some legal analysis. She's a CBS News legal contributor and a professor at Loyola Law School. So listen, Errol, we'll start with you. What more can you tell us about the judge's, well, the judge hasn't made a decision yet. So what more can you tell us about what's been unfolding in the court?
Yeah, Vlad and Anne-Marie, great to connect with you again. There have been some fireworks this morning. The judge, Juan Merchan, has reserved a decision on this gag order, but we do expect an update on that imminently. So as soon as we have that, I'll share that with you. Effectively, the prosecution has argued that Donald Trump has violated the court's gag order some 10 times by way of his Truth Social posts. And they say those posts have aimed to intimidate potential witnesses and jurors as well as part of evidence. They point to a Trump Truth Social post from last week, which quotes a conservative commentator on cable news discussing prospective jurors. And they then connect the dot with a day last week where a woman who was a prospective juror said she couldn't serve, there was too much media pressure, and that her relatives had already identified her through the press. And so the prosecution is saying that's just one example of how Donald Trump, as a defendant in this trial, is violating the gag order, which is meant to protect the procedure and to protect the people who are part of the process. When Donald Trump's lawyer stepped up to make his case, he argued that that was not the case at all. Mr. Trump has a right to defend himself, but Judge Juan Merchan said, defend himself against what? Point me to the comments from these either jurors or prospective witnesses that the president is responding to, and Mr. Blanche couldn't do that. He then went on to say that the judge to Mr. Blanche that he's losing credibility. You know, the judge was raising his voice as he said that, and the judge then called for a short recess while he reserves decision. So in just this first few moments of today, it's Donald Trump seeming on his back foot with his legal team, unable to explain why he needs to make these types of comments about prospective witnesses like Michael Cohen or potential jurors.
So, Jessica, let's talk about what this means with
what
regard.
we heard in the courtroom. I mean, what do you make of these? I don't think you're supposed to be that annoying to the judge this early on.
And this is a judge. I mean, you know, a few of us have ever been standing before a judge. I never have, really, I don't think. But, like, I just can't imagine any kind of belligerence or anything when it comes to a judge sitting on a bench.
So it is really extraordinary. I think Errol in his excellent reporting used the word fireworks. You never want to be here, at least if your goal is to try to not annoy the judge. And if your goal, however, is not to argue to the audience in the courtroom, but to argue to the audience outside the courtroom, then maybe what's happening isn't quite as bad for the former president. So I think we need to kind of separate the legal from the political here. Legally, he is a criminal defendant inside a courtroom with a judge. And as I said, you never want to have the judge say something to your attorney like, you are losing credibility. That's just another way of saying, I don't trust you. Where's your precedent? Where's your facts? There really was no, as far as we can see from the reporting, facts or law to back up what they were arguing in saying that Trump didn't violate the gag order. Now, there's a separate question here as to whether or not if Trump violates the gag order and is then fined for that, that is actually a political win for him. And I know this sounds strange, but every time the former president gets a gag order, because he did in another case as well out of New York, and is found to violate that gag order, he uses it, as a talking point to argue that these trials are just about trying to silence him, that the prosecutors are all just on a political witch hunt, and there's no there. So I think that we see kind of a two-pronged attack. So one is what's happening in the courtroom. Errol said he's starting the day on his back foot. I think that's exactly right. One is outside the courtroom. arguably this might play very well with his supporters.
So can I just bring up what it seems like? This is based on some of our reporters that are in the courtroom kind of live giving us updates as we go along. But so it seems like the two arguments from his attorneys are, one, it was a repost. We're talking about reposts, so that doesn't really count. And the judge was like, well, some of them, he was quoting. He had to literally type tab or shift and then quotation marks.
Right.
But you had to put the effort in. And then also that he had been politically attacked. And when the judge sort of asked, well, give me a recent example, he wasn't able to. But the points are, these are reposts. How was he supposed to know this was a violation? And when you're being politically attacked or being attacked, what are you supposed to do? Do either of those arguments hold any legal weight?
So I will say I don't think they're the legal arguments that you want to be making inside a courtroom if your goal is to have the judge say you did not violate the gag order. Now, having said that, I'm not saying that the judge is going to come back in 30 seconds and say every one of these posts or reposts violated the gag order. One thing that you asked, and this is so interesting and important, we don't have a ton of case law about social media and, frankly, fill in the blank. Privacy rights, First Amendment rights, gag orders, because that is still technology that's developing and the law is trying to keep up with that. Having said that, I think what we heard from the judge is that the former president had to take explicit steps, even if it's just a repost, to put that content on his page. And I don't hear from the reporting the judge saying, oh, well, there's something fundamentally different about typing out a post or partially typing out a post and a repost. Now, this is, again, developing. Is a like on Facebook or a love on Instagram the same as actually uttering those words or publishing that particular picture? These are questions that we need to answer, but I'm not sure when it comes to a gag order. And let's remember why it was imposed, because this judge wants to protect the proceedings. Errol talked about this. He wants to protect the jurors, the prosecutors, the court staff. I'm not sure that just saying I only reposted is really going to be a winning argument here when that content still shows up on his social media page.
So, Jessica, tension seemed already high between the former president's legal team and the judge. I mean, this is the start of the trial. We're not even into the nitty-gritty yet. What does this dynamic mean in the days and weeks ahead?
Well, you just don't want to be here where you have a judge saying, I'm not really trusting you. Now, having said that, there's a difference between a judge saying you're losing me and losing the jurors. And the jurors are the fact finders here. And what we have in Judge Merchan, all indications are, is a very professional judge who I think would not allow his particular views on, for instance, the gag order arguments to bleed over and for him to show the jurors what his views are of the defense's arguments. I think they will see that in other ways when we actually start in earnest with more of the witnesses, more of the evidence. Then the jurors are going to be watching the judge because he's in some ways their proxy for, is this a good argument? Is there a there here? So I don't think this means the case is over. I just think it means that, frankly, I would, show this to my students and say, as a lawyer and as a zealous advocate for your client, you don't want a judge to ever say, you're losing me, I'm questioning your legitimacy.
All right, Errol, I know you've been standing by listening to this conversation. Oh, there you are. So, the judge still has to sort of come to a conclusion, though. We haven't heard from him yet.
That's right, Vlad and Anne-Marie. And to add on to what Jessica was just mentioning, we do expect the judge to make a decision here in any moment, and Donald Trump is back inside the courtroom. But when prosecutors were explaining why they think this is happening, Chris Conroy actually said, I'll just take a direct quote, when it comes to what they want the judge to do, Chris Conroy said, quote, we're not yet seeking an incarceratory penalty, although the defendant seems to be angling for that. Conroy went on to say, remind him, Trump, that incarceration is an option should this continue. So that kind of speaks to Jessica's point, the political benefit, perhaps, if there is a punishment that Judge Juan Merchan places on Donald Trump, because as was true, I think, in the past 24 to 48 hours, Mr. Trump will continue to raise money and campaign based on the intricacies of what's happening inside the courtroom so that he can seem like an underdog to his supporters across the country. As I've said, the courtroom is the campaign trail, but the prosecutors do believe that there is a motivation for Trump to violate these gag orders, effectively to bait the judge into punishing him. They seem to be angling for a financial penalty, but the judge could issue a stern warning to Donald Trump that if he continues to make similar types of remarks, Truth Social quotes or not, that there could be an increased punishment for that.
Yeah, Jessica, it does seem, I mean, when we talk about this gag order, a friend of mine who's been watching the trial texted me and said, wow, it sounds like the judge isn't messing around when it comes to the gag order. But then I wondered if Donald Trump will use this penalty, whatever it is, as an opportunity to fundraise, and if this doesn't just give him more power. I mean, he can say, look, all I did is what you do. That's part of the shtick, which is, you know, this is what you do. You repost things that you like. So did I. I didn't think there was anything wrong. Now I'm being penalized for it. If they do this to me, they can do it to you.
Right.
I think we've heard that. I mean, he fundraised off the indictments. Every time there was a criminal indictment or a civil case that was filed against him in the case of the civil fraud action, we saw that he used that as a political talking point, which is frankly very effective when you've been telling people for years and years that the entire legal system, and particularly the criminal justice system, is out to get you, and that you are, as you said, kind of just there first. You're the first line of defense, but if they're coming after him, they're going to then come after you as well. Then I think it is, frankly, an effective argument every time you have something else happen against you. Now, look, let's be clear. I don't think that Trump wants to be convicted on criminal charges, but I think what he has made a calculation about, and the prosecution said this fairly explicitly, is that if the judge does find that he violates this gag order, that probably is a political win for him. And that, frankly, if he has to pay $5,000 or $50,000, if it's $5,000 for each one of these posts at issue, he's probably going to fundraise a lot more than whatever that figure is. Now, of course, we could have a different conversation about how you finish the end of that sentence, right? So the beginning of the sentence is they're coming after me and they're coming after you next. But the next part of that sentence is that only if you engage in the same type of conduct that the former president does. And that's a different conversation, obviously.
Right. You have to be in the middle of a criminal trial in which you're the defendant. I think that's one of the things.
Yeah.
So as I understand it, I don't know, Errol, if you're sort of aware of this, Donald Trump's been posting about the judge. I mean, now.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly what we're discussing. Donald Trump posted to Truth Social while we've been speaking. So at about 11 a.m. this morning, he posted to Truth Social saying, I'll just roughly quote, highly conflicted, to put it mildly. Judge Juan Merchan has taken away my constitutional right, Donald Trump says, to free speech. Everybody's allowed to talk and lie about me, but I'm not allowed to defend myself. This is a kangaroo court, and the judge should recuse himself. That Donald Trump posts at 11 a.m. Eastern to Truth Social while Judge Merchan in the courtroom behind me is deciding on what, if any, penalty there should be for comments Trump makes about the judge, about witnesses and prospective jurors. And so there seems to be this line that Donald Trump is approaching, is crossing, and the prosecution believes, based on what was said this morning, that Trump is baiting the judge into punishing him somehow. And we should hear what that punishment will be. But to be clear to our viewers, this is not happening in front of the jury just yet. But they are standing by waiting to enter the room and listen to the continued testimony from David Pecker, who was Donald Trump's friend and publisher of the National Enquirer, and can explain this catch and kill concept when it comes to suppressing negative stories. You know, these payments, these 34 felony counts, were for so-called hush money payments about those sexual encounters. Perhaps Donald Trump has made a calculation that he knows where this is going, but at the moment, the functions, the movement of decisions in this courtroom is held up because of the posts Mr. Trump continues to make on his social media platform.
So, Errol, this is a two-part question. First part to you and then the second part to Jessica, which is, to your point about the speculation that former President Trump is baiting the judge into penalizing him for these posts and for violating his gag order, it's been reported by some of his attorneys that he likens himself to Nelson Mandela, right? And Errol, you and I both covered Nelson Mandela when he was alive and sadly when he passed. And we know what Nelson Mandela represents to people all over the world. Donald Trump sees himself in that very same light.
And also Al Capone.
Is that right?
He did compare himself to Al Capone as well.
Wow. Okay. Al Capone and Nelson Mandela. But to both of you, that point that he sees himself as a martyr and is willing to martyr himself is a fascinating one. And so that's to you, Errol. And then Jessica, after Errol gives me his thoughts, I want to know what the maximum penalty that the judge can impose. And if he's also aware, I know that we want the judges to do what they're supposed to do, but does he understand the political implications and ramifications of the decisions that he's making? Errol, first to you.
Well, Vlad, I'll say that in watching Donald Trump, and I remember, being inside the courtroom during the E. Jean Carroll defamation trial, it is a completely different person than appears in front of cameras outside and what he posts on Truth Social and what he says to the public than what you see inside the courtroom. And what I mean by that is as verbose as he is, as sweeping his comparisons are, as bold as his statements are, in the courtroom, it's completely tempered. And really, for a jury, that's when reality kind of hits, where you realize in this building, he's the defendant. We saw this during opening statements when Alvin Bragg's prosecutors kept referring to Donald Trump as the defendant, whereas Todd Blanche, when speaking about Mr. Trump, would say the president. He's earned that title and role. Mr. Trump seems to have this style of communication outside the courtroom that really has not been tempered and seems to be aimed at continuing to raise money for his campaign. But the folks inside who will decide his fate are 12 so-called average New Yorkers selected and approved by both sides, and they just need to decide whether or not he's believable, whether or not he's credible. So for his lawyer to already hear from the judge that he's suffering a credibility issue isn't a positive sign, and the kinds of things that work for Donald Trump as a candidate publicly don't work inside a courtroom, especially when you consider that massive $80 million plus judgment against him for defamation in a completely different and separate and apart case. So it's fascinating to see the dichotomy and the discrepancy between those two types of Trump.
And then Jessica.
Well, I think it's inappropriate, frankly, for the judge to make a determination based on the political optics of this. So the judge needs to look at the gag order that he implemented, and he needs to look at whether or not it was violated and how he is controlling his proceedings. And I would offer that anything else goes outside of the lane of what the judge has the power and discretion to do.
That is fascinating. Yeah, you would think that there would be some thought to that, but no, that's not what they're there for, right?
Yeah.
They're there just to decide whether or not the order that he's given to the defendant has been violated, and if he feels that it has. So, Jessica, remind us again what the maximum penalties are.
So I believe the maximum penalties here are $5,000 per violation. And of course, this can be ratcheted up to jail time. Now, that's not what the prosecution, as Errol mentioned, that's not what the prosecution is asking for. It's not what the judge would give in this situation. So we're really just talking about a monetary fine, and maybe in order to do something like take the post down, that would make a lot of sense because you want to try and lessen the harm, even though, of course, once it's out there, it's out there.
It's already out there. Yeah.
All right, Errol, Jessica, great talking to you guys.
Thank you, guys.